Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my weekly take on the astrology. What's happening up there in the stars? Well, last week was certainly the week that was. And if you watched my last video, you know I spent quite a lot of time talking about that full moon in Gemini and what it augured for the British general election. And the idea that the people would be giving their judgment on Boris turned out to be very true. And he, of course, won an overwhelming victory. However, it has to be said that Jeremy Corbyn, also a Gemini, also with that full moon on his Mercury, had quite the reverse experience. And I'll come along and talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So for now, I want to talk about what's happening this week. First of all, we have Neptune and Uranus center stage. Mercury is angling Neptune, Mercury, the planet of communication, and Venus, the planet of love, finance, and all things nice, will also be angling Uranus. Two more things happen. Venus enters the sign of Aquarius, and the Sun enters the sign of Capricorn. And I'm going to start with the Sun entering Capricorn, because, as you know, I never tire of saying that, you know, we talk about being on the cusp, but you're never either, you know, a mixture of both signs. You're always one sign or the other. So it's very important to know the time you were born, if you were born around the time that the sun sign changes. And of course, if you know babies are going to be born this week, maybe even one of your own, it will be important to know whether your little one is a Sagittarian or a Capricorn. So born at 4:21 in the morning, GMT, UTC, it will be a Capricorn, and before that time, a Sagittarian. And 4:21 GMT means 11:21 in the evening, the day before, on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And if you live in the Antipodes, then it's going to be 3:21 in the afternoon of the 22nd of December. Now, this just reminds me of something that was just very, very interesting. Some years ago, when Prince George was born, the first child of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, the idea was that it was going to arrive in early July. And so I was planning a holiday. I was traveling, a driving holiday. So I booked the family and everybody on a ferry boats. I did everything for the sort of end of July, second half of July. Well, lo and behold, it turned out that either Prince George was a little bit late or that the rumor mill was completely wrong. And I was sitting in Amsterdam when Prince George was born. And I was actually sitting at a cafe, at a table, having a coffee and writing my interpretation of what Prince George was going to be like. It was about, 7, 8 in the evening. I got back to my hotel, only to find when I switched on the news that actually he'd been born in the afternoon. So I'd been writing about Prince George as a sun Leo with the moon in Aquarius, and he ended up as a sun Cancerian with the moon in Capricorn, a completely different kind of quality to the horoscope. Now, you might say, well, I mean, he is who he is. He was born at that time. He was born to be Prince George. But if you're an astrologer, and from my kind of astrology, then we are born at a time where the planets and the horoscope, if you like, reflect exactly who we are. So Prince George was always meant to be a Cancerian with a moon in Capricorn. It was never intended to be a Leo with a moon in Aquarius, which of course would have made him a very kind of different person. So long-winded description of why it's so important to know the time of birth. Venus and Aquarius. Now, every time Venus moves into your own sun sign, whatever your sun sign is, it's a 28-day to 30-day period where good things can happen. They're not going to happen every day. World peace isn't going to break out. All those things aren't going to necessarily be off the wall fantastic. But you'll get a couple of days where the world really, really looks kind of rosy. And depending on whether you've got other planets in certain places and what else you've got going on, could really be important. It could be time to get married, you could fall in love, you could have something else happen to you that really put you in the limelight and really made that time very, very special for you. And so for Aquarius, that time is coming up. And I also want to mention Leo, because for you, Venus will be moving through the area of relationships. So again, what you've got is an opportunity to meet someone. If you're looking for romance or a partner, then Venus is certainly in the right place. And I certainly find that when you've got Venus in your 7th house, it just suddenly seems as though there are a lot of nice, attractive people out there. And it is a good time to form friendships and relationships, or even business partnerships. For Taurus, Venus in Aquarius means Venus is moving through the 10th house of career, life direction, ambitions, aspirations. So it's a good time perhaps to air your ambitions before people, to maybe interview, and for good things just to happen spontaneously, connected to the things you are looking to achieve in your world. For Scorpios, Venus will be moving through the very base of your horoscope. So we're looking at things to do with the roots of life, your home, your family, the foundations of the future. And obviously we're just heading into the holidays. So maybe you're already expecting to spend time with a family or have some pretty special family occasions anyway. And maybe, just maybe, there's a little sprinkling of romance under the mistletoe this year. So let's move on to really the aspects. Mercury in a square to Neptune. Well, this is definitely the season for Neptune. When we look around, we're going through the shopping malls, or we're in the high street, or people's homes, the decorations, the sparkly lights, the music, the sense of excitement before Christmas is very Neptunian. It's not really real. It's just an effect. And that's all wonderful and to be embraced. What isn't to be embraced is if we kind of miss the point, we lose the plot, we lose our way with situations. And that's often happens under a Mercury-Neptune square. So always know where you're going. Always have a map and a sat-nav. And the other thing to remember is not to be taken up by spin. And of course, you know, when we think about spin, we often think about spin doctors and politics, and maybe we have to watch out particularly for this in our particular nation this week. Venus and Uranus have a whole different kind of atmosphere about them. Things happen suddenly and unexpectedly with Uranus. It's the planet of the unexpected. Certainly with Venus involved, this is a time when romances can suddenly begin. And of course, again, we're in the right season, aren't we? Christmas parties. So there's Venus, Uranus lighting up our lives by getting us into a head spin because we're feeling very attracted to someone. But the opposite side of that is equally true, that spats can suddenly happen, and somebody can tread on our very sensitive extremities, and before we know where we are, we've had a friendship bust up, a business breakup, or something a little bit more serious. And I think in general, although I think Scorpios, especially if you're a late October Scorpio, Taurians if you're a late April Taurian, Aquarians if you're a late January Aquarian, and Leos if you're a late July Aquarian, Leo, then you're much more susceptible to the Uranus factor at the moment. So just need to not get too tired or too exhausted, and so that you're quite chilled. And, you know, if somebody says something they didn't mean to say, there's no need to get bent out of shape about it. Let's smooth it over before we end up with a real crisis we have to deal with. And of course, things can get pretty explosive generally. So we want to keep our eyes out in the world for things suddenly happening, and perhaps things that have been bubbling away under the surface suddenly erupting. And I think the idea that the moon in Scorpio over the weekend is probably the most likely time for any kind of eruption. So I mentioned I would talk a little bit more about last week's full moon, and that's not because I want to labor the point Yes, you got that, Jeremy Corbyn, Labour. But in as much as, we had Boris having an overwhelming victory, the judgment of the people, that full moon on his Mercury, that we could see quite clearly brought closure and completion in a good way for him. Let's look at Jeremy Corbyn, also a Gemini, with Mercury in Gemini as well, that full moon close to that Mercury. For him, that closure and completion gave a very different kind of result. Now, you will see in this chart that I've got Neptune rising here in Libra. Now, that I cannot tell you that that is definitely the case. This is my playing around with Jeremy's chart and thinking, to me, he's very equivocal. You never get a straight answer from Mr. Corbyn. He's always playing both ends against the middle. And that is at one time a rather Libran function, but stick Neptune on there as well, and you've got deep mystification everywhere. And I think that if you also look at Mr. Corbyn's chart, and it doesn't really matter what time he was born, you'll also notice that he's got his nodal axis at 23 degrees of Libra Aries. And again, if you listen to my last week's video, I talked about Eris. And Eris, the goddess of destruction, of chaos, of transformation, Pluto's consort, if you like, the opposite, the female equivalent of Pluto. Eris right now is at 23 degrees of Aries. So that was definitely playing into Mr. Corbyn's experience during this, this election. And actually, if you're really interested in this kind of thing, on my website, on my Friday Bite, I've done a really in-depth look at everything political about this election, including the fact that the Labour Party's Pluto is at 20 degrees of Gemini rising. And that full moon hit that squarely. So we can see in a way why there is so much chaos and devastation in the Labour Party and with their leader. But let's come back to me again. And I suppose I always like to end with something really positive so that we set out on the week ahead with a good thought. And that good thought this week is inspired by what happened to me last week. And I was in my local high street in a queue and got talking to the lady behind. And she said something so nice to me, so warming. I quite forgot, all the ills I was feeling about my week generally. And it makes me think really that, especially in Britain, we're a little bit too reserved and we don't always thank people profusely. We don't always tell people how nice they are, or those things. They don't come easily to the British temperament. In America, they come a lot easier, and people are always telling each other how great they are and all that kind of thing, which sometimes makes a compliment a little bit insincere. But somewhere in the middle is that right thing when we genuinely say to somebody, thank you, or how much I appreciate you, or how wonderful you are, or that's a very nice thing to do. That gives you a very nice warm glow. It makes your day, if you're on the receiving end of a compliment or a gesture of affection and appreciation. And of course, it does us good as well, because it's genuine. Wouldn't do if it wasn't. So that's my recommendation this week. Say one nice thing to one person next week. Make their day and make your day too. Have a good week, and I will see you next week, same time, same place. Take care.